Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In today's episode, we will share some true hospital horror stories that will remind you not everything in a hospital is meant to heal. For most of us, these places, where life and death are in constant conflict, seem to attract something darker or something unexplainable. But before starting the video, please consider giving us a like also. If you have any terrifying or unnerving experiences of your own, feel free to reach out and share your story with us. Who knows, it might even be featured in one of our future episodes. Now turn down the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself. John had always preferred the night shift. It was quieter, less chaotic, and gave her time to finish her rounds in peace. St. Mary's Hospital was old, its hallways lined with flickering fluorescent lights and outdated equipment. Many of her colleagues avoided the graveyard shift, citing the eerie silence that seemed to settle over the hospital after midnight. But Claire had never believed in ghost stories, not until that night. It started like any other shift. Claire was going through patient charts at the nurse's station when she first heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from somewhere down the hallway. She paused, tilting her head to listen. It sounded like someone crying, soft, pitiful sobs that echoed faintly in the stillness. Claire frowned. Most of the rooms in her wing were unoccupied, and the few patients admitted were either sedated or asleep. She glanced at the clock, 2:07 a.m. The sound was faint but persistent, tugging at her curiosity. She stood and walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. As she approached room 307, the crying grew louder. Claire stopped in front of the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She hesitated. Room 307 had been closed for months due to renovations. The last patient admitted there had passed away under tragic circumstances, and since then, the staff avoided mentioning it. Some of her co-workers whispered about strange occurrences, lights flickering, doors opening on their own, but Claire had always dismissed it as superstition. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room was dark, the blinds drawn tightly shut. Moonlight filtered through the gaps, casting faint silvery streaks across the empty bed. The sobbing stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. "Hello?" Claire called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. She stepped inside, her shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. A chill settled over her, the kind that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. As she turned to leave, she felt it, a cold, clammy hand gripping her wrist. She gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. Her heart raced as she stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, Claire couldn't shake the experience. She confided in Margaret, an older nurse who had worked at St. Mary's for decades. Margaret listened intently, her expression growing grim. "Room 307, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's where Emily died." Emily had been a long-term patient, abandoned by her family. She had spent weeks crying out for someone to visit her, but no one ever came. She passed away alone in that room, her sobs echoing through the halls on her final night. Margaret leaned in closer. "You're not the first to hear her. Others have reported the same thing, but you're lucky, Claire. She only wanted someone to listen. Some people say she's touched them, tried to pull them back into the room." From that night on, Claire made a point to avoid room 307, but even years later, she could still hear faint sobbing when walking past it late at night. Alex had worked as a janitor at St. Joseph's Hospital for nearly 15 years. He knew the building like the back of his hand. Every creaky stair, every dimly lit corridor, every out-of-service elevator. The hospital had been built in the 1950s, and while it had undergone several renovations, there were still areas that felt frozen in time. It was a quiet night when Luis encountered the elevator for the first time. He had just finished cleaning the 5th floor and was heading back to the janitor's closet to store his supplies. As he walked past the elevators, he heard a familiar ding. He glanced over his shoulder. One of the elevator doors had opened, but no one stepped out. Luis frowned. It wasn't uncommon for old elevators to malfunction, but something about this felt off. The doors remained open, as if waiting for him to enter. Curious, Luis approached cautiously. The elevator was empty, its interior dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent light. He hesitated, then stepped inside, gripping his mop tightly. He pressed the button for the lobby, and the elevator doors closed with a jarring clunk. At first, everything seemed normal. The elevator began to descend, the floor numbers lighting up one by one. But then, it started going up. Luis stared at the display, confused. The hospital only had 6 floors, but the elevator kept ascending. 7, 8, 9. Panic set in as the numbers continued climbing, faster now, until the display became a blur of flashing digits. The elevator shuddered to a stop, and the door slid open. Luis stepped back, his heart pounding. The corridor before him was unlike anything he'd seen in the hospital. The walls were cracked and covered in peeling paint, the air thick with the stench of mildew. Flickering lights cast eerie shadows, and the faint sound of whispers echoed from somewhere in the distance. "Hello?" Luis called out, his voice shaky. There was no response. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, turning into an unintelligible cacophony. A shadowy figure appeared at the end of the hallway, slowly moving toward him. Terrified, Luis began pressing the close door button frantically. The elevator jolted, descending rapidly. When the doors finally opened again, Luis was back on the 5th floor. He stumbled out, drenched in sweat, and vowed never to use that elevator again. To this day, no one knows where the elevator had taken him, or what it wanted. Raj was a medical student, working the night shift during his residency at a small rural hospital. He had heard stories from other residents about strange occurrences during late shifts, but he had always dismissed them as jokes or exaggerated tales. One night, Raj was assigned to monitor a coma patient, a man in his late 50s who had been unresponsive for weeks. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the faint glow of the heart monitor. Raj sat in the corner, flipping through medical notes to pass the time. Hours passed uneventfully, and Raj found himself fighting off sleep. That's when he noticed it, a shadow flickering on the far wall. At first, he thought it was the heart monitor casting a reflection, but as he looked closer, he realized the shadow was moving, slowly, deliberately, independent of any light source. He sat up, his eyes fixed on the wall. The shadow seemed to grow larger, darker, as if it were creeping closer to the patient's bed. "Is someone there?" Raj whispered, his voice trembling. The shadow froze, then darted across the room. The heart monitor began to spike, its beeping growing louder and more erratic. Raj stood, paralyzed with fear, as the patient's hand, lifeless for weeks, suddenly twitched. The shadow hovered over the bed, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Raj swore he heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably there. The heart monitor flatlined. The shadow dissolved into the air, leaving the room eerily silent. When doctors rushed in to revive the patient, Raj stood frozen in the corner, unable to speak. He never told anyone what he saw, but he's convinced that the shadow wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something darker, something that had come to claim the patient's soul.